Poison, it must be pointed out, it is the most intimate form of murder. One can be stabbed or shot by an enemy, but the bane draught is usually poured by an intimate posing as a friend.
Happy Halloween!
And thank you for joining me on my new series, Asylum Sundays. I am your host with the squeaky chair, Elle. Today's story is about a nurse and a serial killer. Her name is Jane Toppin. So let's get into it. Jane Toppin was born Honora Kelly in Boston, Massachusetts in either 1857 or 1854. But either way, she was born, and she was born to two Irish immigrants, Peter and Bridget Kelly. Honora had at least two siblings, though again the accounts change, but we know for sure that she had two older sisters, Nellie and Delia. When Honora was very young, her mother died of consumption, which is tuberculosis, and her father had the two girls on his own. He was really struggling with his mental health after the death of Bridget, and he seemed to spiral, and it was known that he was like an alcoholic who was really explosive and even abusive. He had the nickname of Kelly the Crackpot, which basically means like a foolish or impractical person. So that's just kind of the person he was. Her father seemed to have gone through several jobs, which wasn't uncommon at the time. If anything, he was lucky to even get a job because he was an Irish immigrant. The last known job that their father had was a tailor. A few years later, their father, Peter, was no longer able to care for the two young girls, Honora, who was 6, and Delia, who was 8. So they were sent to live in the Boston Female Asylum. Peter also went and stayed in an insane asylum, and he was allegedly said to have tried to sew his eyes shut with an upholstery needle while he was a tailor. I'm going to insert a photo in case you've never seen one of those bad boys. And that legend is the inspiration for today's look. I'm going to try to get a little closer without knocking everything over so you can see it better. Unfortunately, I couldn't get stitches through, so I just did like a safety pin. I hope you guys appreciate me because I got scab blood in my eyelashes for you and in my hair, which isn't as bad. And hopefully they don't all fall out. But anyway, so he allegedly sewed his eyelids shut with an upholstery needle. Honora's oldest sister, Nellie, was committed to an asylum by the age of 20, and she was said to have been violently insane. She spent the rest of her life in a series of institutions. So the family was really plagued with mental illness. Now, the two little girls, they were sent to the Boston Female Asylum, which is the first charity created and operated by women in Boston, Massachusetts. It had a lot of big-name supporters, such as First Lady Abigail Adams, Miss John Quincy Adams, Miss Elizabeth Adams, wife of Sam Adams, and several other well-known families in the Boston area. This asylum was actually an orphanage for indigent and fair, fragile form little girls. That's their saying. Fair, fragile form. I don't know what that means. Blonde, skinny bitches. The owner of this asylum was Hannah Stillman. She was the wife of a reverend, and they had something like 14 kids, so she probably ran a tight ship and was totally accustomed to like bossing a bunch of kids around. When examined at the Boston Female Asylum, it was said that the two girls, Honora and Delia, were dressed in old raggedy clothes. They had really poor hygiene. They were believed to be neglected and even abused at the hands of their father. In the official records of the asylum, it states they were rescued from a very miserable home. Because of all of this, they were allowed to stay at the asylum. And neighbors also said that the girls had bruises, but it's only speculation that it's at the hands of their father, Peter. The girls at the asylum were taught basic domestic skills like sewing, cooking, cleaning. They were generally held there until the age of 10. From then on, they would be placed with foster parents. Honora and her sister Delia were really close in age, and they were kind of the only comfort that each other had from home. But unfortunately, Delia was fostered out to a couple and eventually became a sex worker, an alcoholic, and died of what they called squalid circumstances, which is like living in squalor. When Honora was around 8 years old, a rich widowed woman named Anne Toppin came to the asylum in search for indentured servants, and she laid her eyes on Honora. That's because rich white women who have too much money and need their toilets cleaned they like take kids from orphanages. Totally normal. It's just white people shit. Anne decided to take little Honora to her home in Lowell, Massachusetts. However, Anne was a very racist woman, and like many people at that time, she hated the Irish, and especially Irish Catholic. Anne changed Honora Kelly's name to Jane Toppin and gave her like a new family background as well. From this point forward, I will call Honora Jane Toppin. Jane was advised by Anne to say that her family were Italian and that they died at sea due to a fever. Luckily for Jane, she was what was considered Black Irish, which means like a dark featured Irish person. So this was a pretty believable lie. Anne also made Jane call her Auntie, which is strange, but that's just what was asked of her, so she just did it. Auntie would constantly say things like, "You can't help being Irish, but that doesn't mean you have to act like a Patty." The word Patty is actually a racial slur for Irish. Irish were also called the N-word with a hard R, turned inside out, and the blacks of Europe, just to kind of give you an idea of how they were looked at. Auntie was also really old-fashioned when it came to discipline, and when it came to Jane especially, she definitely didn't spare the rod. Jane was also beat after leaving her father's home, and we don't really know what happened in the orphanage either. Sorry, not sorry if you can hear the rain. It's just really pouring. Actually, my whole backyard is flooded right now, but we're just gonna keep pushing on because it's nice. This is like your meditation sounds to take a little nappy nap. People have told me that my voice is really soothing, so I hope you sleep well listening to me.
Wake up.
Jane was lucky enough to be sent to school with her foster sister Elizabeth and get a proper education. It was said that the kids didn't really like Jane because she would constantly cause drama, she would lie, she told stories, and she would just blame kids for things that she did wrong to get them in trouble. She was super manipulative. But seeing as Auntie had started her off young, telling her to lie about her family, I could see how it would be easy for Jane to just continuously lie. She was said to have been brilliant and terrible, and adults also called her clever and amusing. Jane's foster sister Elizabeth loved Jane, and she took her under her wing. She would keep her in her Protestant social circles. But Jane was always envious of her foster sister because Auntie or Anne treated Elizabeth very well and constantly belittled and humiliated Jane for her weight, her heritage, and really just anything that she could. So really early on, Jane was bitter and resentful of her lovely sister Elizabeth. But this never stopped Elizabeth for being there for Jane. At the age of 18, Jane was no longer an indentured servant, as the agreement was when taking her from the asylum when she turned 18, she would get 50 whole bucks, which is actually kind of a lot of money then, and a new set of clothes, and she would be no longer in legal debt to serve. But Jane wanted to stay. Like, what else would she do? She had been there from such a young age. You know, she was never legally adopted, but she at least had her room, and she was able to live a life that she was accustomed to, even if that did mean cleaning, but she would be so used to that wouldn't even bother her. Shortly after Auntie passed away, Elizabeth inherited the home. Elizabeth offered Jane to stay there and continue to work for her. Jane agreed, and later she worked for Elizabeth and her new husband, Ormel Brigham. Jane was also said to have been engaged near the same time as Elizabeth, but the man allegedly left her for another woman. Anne, also known as Auntie, left Jane nothing. That would have been really hard as a young girl, like having the only mother figure you really ever knew just leave you nothing after you're trying to constantly live up to her expectations. She just really started out with a rough life. That doesn't excuse anything that happens later. About a decade later, around 1885 to 1887, Jane decided it was time for her to go on her own and move out. She enrolled at the Cambridge Hospital for Nursing. When she left, her foster sister Elizabeth told her she was always welcome and to come back and stay in the family home, and her room would always be waiting for her. She was a really sweet, sweet person. During her education, she was very well liked by the patients and the family of the patients, as well as many doctors. She earned the nickname Jolly Jane because she was known to have always brightened up her patients' morale, and the families loved that she would be able to make their sick family members like laugh and smile. Conditions of nursing were even worse than they are today, if you can even believe that. The nursing students and the nurses were working 12 to 14-hour shifts 7 days a week, about 50 weeks of the year. They had no holidays, no weekends, nothing. So I'm sure most of the nurses were like grumpy and tired, but not Jane. She was just Jolly Jane, being all jolly and happy all the time, pleasantly plump. However, just like at her school in her younger years, she was known as a gossip, a liar, and many of her peers and colleagues did not like being around her at all. She was suspected of stealing multiple times, but she was never caught. And anyone who crossed her, she would do the same as before when she was young, like frame them and get them in trouble. And at least 2 nurses were fired because of her lies. Jane was known to often joke about how there's no use in keeping elderly patients alive, which was not a joke, actually, since she was known to kill elderly patients and even people who were considered close to her. It was said that the other nurses and patients had complained about these comments and were growing nervous of her, like rightfully so, but they were kind of dismissed. Man, y'all didn't even tell me I had latex in my hair. What kind of friends are you? What kind of friend would do that to me? Not a good friend. Not a good friend at all. Nobody came here for the hair. They came here for the murder. During her training, the nurses were called into an autopsy, and she became extremely fascinated with death, the process of death, and she just wanted to learn more. She even attended more autopsies than required, which actually impressed the doctors. This girl is just literally about to get away with murder, you guys. Buckle in. Jane was a nurse that would go above and beyond for a patient she liked in the worst way possible. She would falsify their charts and give them incorrect doses of medication so that they would feel sick or have convulsions and have to remain in the hospital. She would do all that instead of them healing and being able to leave. At some point, Jolly Jane decided she wanted to start experimenting on patients using the medications morphine and atropine. Morphine is a painkiller and like a downer, while atropine was used for people with low heart rate and is also an antidote for overdose of certain medications and poisons. In many patients, the drug morphine makes the pupils smaller and more sort of like pinpoint, and belladonna, which is what atropine is derived from, made your pupils larger, so mixing the 2 drugs actually made it way less suspicious. Jane loved to play God and watch the patients get so low that their respiratory systems would almost quit working after overdosing them on morphine, and then she would inject them with atropine and bring them back to consciousness. She would play with her patients like a cat toys with a mouse. Jane loved to see how animated the bodies would get when she would administer atropine. In her words, she called them her science experiments, and she said that she preferred when patients would have convulsions before slipping into a coma and dying. The doctors at Cambridge loved Jane. They thought she was an amazing nurse. They gave her a glowing recommendation to attend a really respected school, the Massachusetts General Hospital Nursing Program, around 1888. Jane had received praise many times because she was so good at nursing people back to health, when in reality she was just making them sick and would stop poisoning them so that they could recover under her care. The number is unknown, but it is suspected that Jane killed about a dozen people while she was at the Cambridge Hospital, and that's according to like her own calculations, but she couldn't actually remember a number. At Massachusetts General Hospital, she was brought in with high regard. She was easily on the fast track to promotion. She would even be in charge when the head nurse was on leave. Unfortunately for Jane, she didn't realize that this hospital was much tighter ran, and soon her stealing, making up stories, mishandling medication, and trying to throw people under the bus just tarnished her reputation. But at night, when Jane was under less supervision, her experiments continued. One of her victims, however, survived. Her name was Amelia Finney. She had just had surgery at the hospital when Jane administered oral medication to her. Amelia said that the medication tasted funny and was bitter, and she started to slowly kind of like drift in and out of consciousness. However, before being fully sedated, Amelia remembered feeling her clothes being pulled away from her body. She heard the noise of the bed squeaking. Jane was in bed with her. Amelia remembers Jane caressing her hair, kissing all over her face, and whispering to her that things would get better soon. Jane got on top of Amelia and started checking her pupils. Amelia could feel her breathing on her face. Jane grabbed a glass with the medicine in it and put it to Amelia's lips and requested her to drink more, but Amelia said she tried as hard as she could to push her lips together and turn her head. And before being able to administer the lethal injection of morphine, another person actually came into the room, thank God, and startled Jane. So Jane obviously left. The next morning, Amelia remembered all of this, and she was really confused and was unsure of what had happened, so she kind of kept it silent for many years. She just convinced herself that it was a dream. She was too confused and too embarrassed to share that story. So this is where we learn that Jane was not only a poisoner, but she also said that killing her patients made her aroused, which is just disgusting. Though many of the doctors were quite fond of Jane, her peers despised her. She was once again suspected of being back on her bullshit. She stole petty cash, she stole a patient's wedding ring, and she was recklessly administering doses of medication. But they thought this was due to her incompetence. They never expected that she was torturing, assaulting, or killing patients. One of the rules at Massachusetts General Hospital was that you could never leave the hospital without permission. They needed to have all staff counted for and present in the event of an emergency. Jane was all up on her frickin' high horse one day, and she decided that she was just going to leave the grounds, thinking either she wouldn't get caught or she could talk her way out of it. Since Jane had already ruffled the feathers of her peers by doing what Jane does, being a catty bitch, she was snitched on like immediately, and she was dismissed from the hospital. Jane had just passed her exams and was about to get her nursing certificate, but because she was kicked out, she was unable to obtain it. But this is Jane we're talking about. So Jolly Jane, with her gift of the Irish gab, of course, went back to Cambridge and talked her way into getting the exams completed there. She passed all of the exams, of course, because she's a lot of things, but she's definitely not stupid. And she worked there after she was done with school, but she was actually fired pretty quickly when a doctor reported to the board that multiple elderly patients had died under Jane's care. So she was fired for administering opiates recklessly. Later, when asked how she felt about being fired from the two leading hospitals of Massachusetts, she just said, "I didn't care." And that's just kind of how she was. Despite the fact that she had racked up quite the bad reputation, there were many people who loved her and fawned over her as a nurse, and she was highly recommended, again, by doctors to be a private nurse in people's homes. Jane loved this, of course, because there was really no one to oversee her with the patients, had better pay, and sometimes it even came with sort of like housing accommodations where she would stay with the patients. And in 1891, she was a full-time private nurse. Jane was making around $20 to $25 a week, which was great pay at the time. Many women then were making closer to about $5 a week, working in really crappy, like, factory conditions. Jane often stole from her patients, and she was so manipulative that she would weave these intricate lies and people would just believe her. Because Jane was making so much money, she was able to afford some luxuries in life and began drinking good beer, entertaining friends in her time off. She was still known to be like a gossip and turn her friends against each other, but she also had a nice vacation cottage in Cape Cod and was really entertaining, so people just put up with her bullshit. She also lived as a boarder in Cambridge with an elderly couple named Israel and Lovely Dunham. She lived there for several years, and Jane didn't like spending her money on housing. She despised how feeble and fussy the elderly landlord was, so she got the idea that she could just kill Israel Dunham by slowly poisoning him with his tea. Once he became sick, she was right by his side to nurse him back to health, but he slipped in and out of a coma until he finally died at her hand. Once he passed away, Jane comforted his wife, Lovely. Jane was her companion and caregiver for actually a couple years until sealing the same fate for Lovely. Jane said she killed Lovely because she was old and cranky. Man, Jane would hate me in the mornings. I am also old and cranky. In 1899, Jane was recommended to take care of a patient by their family doctor. This patient was 77-year-old Mary McNear. Jane killed Mary within a day of being her nurse, which is weird because Jane really liked to stretch out killing people and experiment with them, torture them, but she didn't know Mary McNear very well and killed her almost immediately, and maybe it's because she didn't really know her. After Mary's funeral, the family noticed a bunch of her expensive clothing was missing, and they called the doctor that recommended Jane, asking if they thought she would be responsible for stealing them, and he told them Jane is one of the finest women and best nurses he knew, and he would not listen to anything against her. So the family just dropped it. Jane's foster sister, Elizabeth, that I mentioned earlier, told Jane how she was feeling a bit depressed lately. And of course, if Jane smells a weakness, she's all over that, like any opportunistic, manipulative narcissist would be. And Jane quickly talks Elizabeth into visiting her in her vacation home in Cape Cod. They spent a couple days catching up, like doing their little sister thing. And one day, Jane took her on a picnic. During the picnic, she brought corned beef, taffy, and mineral water. All were laced with strychnine. Over the next few days, Jane played her little experiments out on her sister using her notorious morphine and atropine methods, watching her convulse and grow weaker and weaker. And a few days later, her sister passed away. In later years, after Jane had been caught for her crimes, she described Elizabeth's death, and she said, "Elizabeth was the first of my victims that I actually hated and poisoned with a vindictive purpose. So I let her die slowly with gripping torture. I fixed mineral water so it would do that, and then I added the morphia to it. I held her in my arms and watched with delight as she gasped her life out." Jane said that Elizabeth was the only person that she killed with malicious intent and that she had deep-seated hatred for her sister. So now what, Jane? Oh, right. Of course, now Jane has to go comfort her brother-in-law. That's what she does. And that is Elizabeth's husband, Ormel. She went, she helped him with the funeral, told him that Elizabeth's wishes were that she wanted Jane to have her gold watch and chain, which he didn't even question this because Elizabeth truly loved Jane, so he just gave Jane the items. Jane was extremely desperate to prove that she was better than her sister, who she had always envied, and so she tried to seduce her brother-in-law, Ormel, but he never showed any interest. Jane was living in the house with him, as well as his sister and the housekeeper. So after 3 days, she murdered the housekeeper. Her name was Florence Calkins, and she killed her in order to gain employment with Ormel and keep him close, but she was also suspicious that Florence was trying to get with Ormel. She said, "I was jealous of her. I knew she wanted to become Mr. Brigham's wife. He wanted nothing to do with Jane, either romantically or like employment-wise, and he actually asked her to leave. Of course, this is devastating to Jane's massive ego because that's all she is at this point. And during the same time, Jane had a patient named William Ingram who was actually killed really hastily, so I don't have much information on him. Now, Jane was down on her luck, so she had to move on to her next victim and opportunity. Jane had a good friend for several years named Sarah Myra Connors, who went by the name Myra. Myra worked at St. John's Theological School in Cambridge. This job came with good pay, a servant, and an apartment. So, of course, Jane wanted all this to herself. So she went to visit with Myra. Come to find out, Myra had a case of peritonitis, so Jane was on the case, ready to nurse her back to health. Unfortunately, but not shockingly, Myra passed away about 4 days later. Myra's doctor said that she died an agonizing death with such terrible convulsions that her arm was bent almost completely in half. Man, I ain't telling any of my friends any good things about my job because you can't trust these hoes. At Myra's funeral, Jane went up to her boss and told him that when she had died, she had recommended Jane to take over her position and that she owed it to Myra to try her best. But Jane had not expected this job to be something she couldn't handle because she's a narcissistic asshole. And unfortunately for her, she was not competent enough for this career and was fired for her lack of experience. Now, Jane is feeling defeated again, and her ego took a blow after being rejected by her brother-in-law and now this new job. So she went back to the cottage on Cape Cod. That was her vacation home. She had rented this cottage for a group of years at this point. However, she was late on her rent. And so she left and went back to Cambridge, where she boarded with a couple named Melvin and Eliza Beatles. Jane had poisoned this couple just enough so that they were convinced that they had food poisoning, and then she nursed them back to health. And that is how she kind of gained people's trust, it seems like. She also drugged their housekeeper, Mary Sullivan, to make her seem drunk, and snitched on her so she could take her position as the housekeeper while living with the Beatles. I mean, she has a strong work ethic. She always working. The cottage in Cape Cod was owned by the Davis family. The Davis family was a really well-to-do family, but in the town, there was actually a legend about them. It was said that they were cursed. See, they had a friend who was part of their Advent church named Charles Freeman. Charles Freeman suffered from some sort of religious psychopathy and thought that God had come to him in dreams telling him he had to sacrifice a child, his own child, and give his own family to God as an act of faith. Charles was admired and he was actually thought to be a really good dude. One night after one of his dreams, he woke up and went into his favorite daughter's room. Her name was Edith. She was 4 years old and he murdered her. I'm trying to avoid too much regarding children in this video, so I'll spare you the details and you can look him up if you want more details. But yeah, so this crazy dude, Charles, the next day he brought his church folks over, and it was like 25 people actually, and he gave them an hour-long sermon addressing what the Lord had said to him in his dream and all that, and then he took them to see his daughter's body. Obviously, all the people that were there were like, what the fuck, Chuck? And he reassured them, like, it's fine, don't worry, she'll be resurrected in 3 days, just like Jesus. Needless to say, she didn't come back to life. So where does this leave the Davis family? Where do they fit in? Why are they cursed? Well, Alden Davis, the one who owns Jane's vacay home, he actually attended the funeral for Edith, and that was about 3 days later. And this dude stood beside the grave of this poor little girl and said, "There never lived a purer man than Charles Freeman." So everyone was like, oh, Alden about to kill his kids too. And they said that they were cursed. Anyway, back to the story of the cottage. So it was a little cottage that shared, I think, the same plot of land as the Davis family house. The owner's wife, Mary Davis, who was known as Maddie, she decided that it was time for Jane to pay her back rent, so she went to collect the money before Jane decided to try and occupy the cottage for another summer. Maddie was welcomed by Jane into the home she was boarding in with the Beatles and offered a glass of mineral water laced with morphine. All of them, Jane, Maddie, and the Beatles, they sat at the table and they ate dinner. After dinner and drinking that whole roofied glass of water, she and Jane went outside to start walking to the bank to get that damn back rent that Jane owed, and Maddie collapsed. Jane alerted the owners of the home, the Beatles, and they were gracious enough to offer Maddie to stay in their empty room so Jane could nurse her back to health. A doctor was summoned, and Maddie was diabetic, so Jane just told the doctor she had eaten a piece of red velvet cake and she got sick immediately. And of course he believed this. Maybe they are cursed because this doctor was summoned, and this doctor was a guy who misdiagnosed a patient. He said they had some sort of stomach issue or something really vague, when really the patient was a victim of a serial killer named Sarah Jane Robinson. She's known as the Boston Borgia, and she's also an Irish woman. This is why my Irish ass stays medicated, you guys. I got these sketchy ass genes. Anyway, this doctor is here with another serial killer victim. So for a week, Jane brought Maddie in and out of consciousness, toying with her life as she has done with so many others, and she would allow her to remain lucid for a few moments. Eventually, she grew bored and murdered Maddie with a lethal dose of morphine. So Jane took it upon herself to help the family by bringing Maddie's body to Cape Cod for them. She took the return seat that Maddie had purchased to return to Cape Cod, and she set on her way. I don't know about now, but back then they would store the bodies with your luggage. So like any luggage that was like checked in would potentially be stored with dead bodies. And can you imagine like coming back from vacation and you're like unpacking and you're like, what does that smell? Oh, what does that smell? And if you've ever smelled a dead body, like you can't unsmell that. That is a smell that stays with you forever. Decomposing flesh is just its own smell. Anyway, when Jane arrived, she did all that she could to help with the funeral and consoling Maddie's husband, Alden, and the Davis's daughters. The family asked her to stay as a guest since she had done so much to help, and of course she just had to stay. That's what she does. But inside her head she said, "You better wait a little while and I will have another funeral for you. If you wait, it will save you going back and forth." And that's as the friends and family departed from Maddie's funeral. So obviously the psycho is planning to take every single one of them out, and they invite her in her home to stay. It's like so messed up. They thought she was such a good person, and she played the part. She really did. While staying with the Davises, Jane grew really bored and she had to entertain herself somehow. Like most serial killers, she was pretty fond of fire. It was said that she had started multiple fires around the house, all of which were put out before something worse happened, luckily. And when she was questioned about it, she made elaborate stories of seeing some stranger stalking the house. She blamed the imaginary guy for the multiple fires, and they believed her. When the fires put too much heat on her, she decided to come up with a story about how one of the Davis's daughters, Genevieve, was in a deep depression after the death of her mother. Jane decided to spread this rumor where she said that Genevieve went to grab a container of arsenic in the shed and she was just staring at it longingly, and then she put it back up on the shelf, and she told this to Maddie, her sister. She made claims that Genevieve was suicidal, and then unfortunately she murdered her. When Genevieve died, Jane said, "Poor thing, she was grieving herself to death, so life wasn't worth living for her anyway." Later, during her confession, Jane said, "I went to the funeral and felt as jolly as can be, and nobody suspected me in the least." She's such a stupid bitch. And then with Genevieve out of the way, she set her sights on the father, Alden Davis. It seems like she really just lost complete control at this time. We see this with serial killers where they do like death, 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 but she just like lost it at this time. She didn't even try to hide it really at this point. Alden had lost his wife and his youngest daughter, and then in less than 2 weeks, he was also dead. She said, "I made it lively for the undertakers and gravediggers that time. 3 graves in a little over 5 weeks in one lot in the cemetery." I hate her. The last member of the Cape Cod house was still standing, and that was, of course, the older daughter, Minnie. While Minnie was in bed dying, the same as the rest of her victims, Jane brought Minnie's 10-year-old son in bed with her. It's not known if Jane assaulted the child or not. Jane was aroused with almost every death, and not only did the surviving victim, Amelia, state this, but Jane too said it, that the crimes were also sexually motivated. But I hope to God that she didn't, and she only said that she held him next to her, so I hope that that's all that happened, since she never showed any interest in children. Before Minnie, the oldest daughter of the Davis family, had passed away, she had been in contact with her father-in-law while her husband was away. Her father-in-law was Captain Gibbs, and he was very suspicious of Minnie's death. He had visited her 2 days earlier, and though she was sad about all of the death around her, she was overall in good health. Then he remembered that Jane had administered an injection to his daughter-in-law, Minnie, but he couldn't think of any reason why she needed it. After Minnie's death, her husband came back, and Jane offered to move in with him and help him raise the now 2 motherless children, but luckily he declined because he don't need no Jane. Captain Gibbs, the father-in-law, pressed the police and consulted with some military doctors and associates that he had, and the DA agreed to exhume the bodies and launch an investigation to look for signs of foul play. The autopsies were performed by Leonard Wood and the renowned toxicologist Edward S. Wood on suspicion of murder, since, the whole entire family died in 1 month and nobody caught on until now. With the heat closing in, Jane decided to go back to her family home in Lowell, Massachusetts and stay with her brother-in-law once again. She was hopeful that this time she could indeed marry Ormel, the husband of her foster sister Elizabeth that she had murdered exactly 2 summers beforehand. Ormel still wanted nothing to do with her. His sister, who was living there also, was taking up too much of his attention and probably wasn't fond of Jane, so Jane killed Ormel's sister, Edna Bannister. In her confession, she said she was a poor old woman and was better out of the way anyhow. So yeah, Edna did not like Jane. Us sisters know. We know. We know who's good for our brothers. Ormel was growing increasingly frustrated with Jane, so she poisoned him and nursed him back to health. And she was hoping that this would, change his mind about being with her, seeing how dedicated she was and how loyal during his time of distress. However, he still wanted nothing to do with her. And of course, that made her spiral because her ego was bruised. She started threatening him, saying that she was going to spread rumors that she was pregnant with his baby. And he just grew completely fed up with her. And he's like, enough's enough. It's time for you to figure out what you're going to do. You need to leave. So instead of leaving, Jane attempted suicide by ingesting morphine, but she did not die and did not gain any sympathy, which is probably what she was really going for. I don't ever want to say that people are acting out for attention when they talk about suicide, but I'm pretty sure this was the case here, because if the lady wanted to die, she of all people would know exactly what it would take. She had killed a shit ton of people at this point. When asked why she tried to kill herself, she said, "I'm tired of life. I know that people are talking about me. I just want to die." After she was back on her feet, Ormel said, "Bye-bye, birdie," and he kicked her ass out for good. With nowhere to go, Jane had reached out to her old friend Sarah Nichols and went to stay with her. By this time, the body of Minnie was exhumed and foul play was suspected. They arrested Jane for the murder of Minnie Gibbs, the eldest Davis daughter. Luckily, Jane had been arrested before killing another close friend of hers because that's sort of her thing. When the detective took her, she said that if he didn't show up when he did, she probably would have killed Sarah as well as Sarah's brother, who was living there at the time. Imagine being Sarah. I would have felt like I won the freaking lottery. Jane was brought to the Barnstable jailhouse, saying that she didn't want to make a statement and she didn't want to get her name in the newspapers. Oh my goodness, you guys. She's shy. How cute. Too bad the dumb broad made the front page for a long time, like many months. While in jail, Jane befriended the jailer's wife, of course, and convinced her that she was innocent, but that didn't really do anything. Jane was suspected to have used arsenic in the murders since it was found in every family member's body in the Davis murders. However, embalming fluid also contained arsenic, as I mentioned in my last video if you haven't seen it. They were at a standstill until Captain Gibbs suggested that she had been using morphine and atropine. He knew this because during the investigation, 2 different pharmacies had remembered a jolly large woman ordering these medications. Jane, of course, said that she was not guilty the whole time, and then the bodies of the Davis parents, Maddie and Alden, were exhumed, and they were found to have the same drugs in their systems. It came out in court that Jane even helped the undertakers prepare the bodies before the funerals. Like, even in death, they could not escape this nasty old broad. I just feel so bad for them. Luckily, 23 members of the grand jury found Jane guilty on 4 counts of murder, the entire Davis family, but even so, Jane still pled not guilty. Jane underwent a psych evaluation, and the experts determined that she was insane. She had irresistible sexual impulse to kill, and she confessed to 11 murders at that time. During her trial, she was found not guilty by reasons of insanity, and she was sentenced to life in the Taunton Insane Hospital. Jane was thrilled about this verdict because she was certain that she could convince the insane asylum that she was sane and not guilty and be released within a month. So delusional. She said, "Don't blame me, blame my nature. Honey, your nature is hella nasty." Taunton Insane Hospital was also known as Taunton State Hospital. This facility was built to take on the overflow of the first asylum in Massachusetts in Worcester. This hospital did not become severely overcrowded like many of the East Coast asylums.
Yeah, New York, I'm talking to you.
But it did have a reputation for having a dark and seedy past, much like the others. Fast forwarding to the 70s, the hospital staff was said to have been very weary when going into the lower levels of the building. So they investigated it and dug into the hospital records to see if there would be a reason for the haunting in the lower level. And what they found out was that many times patients would be transferred to these areas in the facility to have illegal experiments done on them. And many patients would go down into the lower levels and never return. And going back to time, in the annual report in 1912, while Jane would have been there, they hired a field worker in eugenics and had multiple outbreaks of infectious disease, which was pretty common in facilities at that time. A couple fires had broken out, and during Jane's stay there were approximately 1,400 to 1,600 patients, so I'm sure that she learned to sit down and behave, because as we learned from the Nellie Bly video, the staff was the law, and I'm sure that Jolly Jane had met her match when dealing with the orderlies and doctors employed at the asylum. I do want to say that, unfortunately, just like the Nellie Bly story and Blackwell's Island's asylum, many people were most likely wrongfully committed, but as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to Jane, she deserved that treatment. Jane's most famous quote is, "This is my ambition, to have killed more people, more hopeless people, than any man or woman who has ever lived." And besides dictators, I mean, she probably got close. Jane had confessed to her defense lawyer and longtime friend, James Stewart Murphy, that she had committed more than 31 murders. And she even said, "How can I be insane? When I killed people, I knew I was doing wrong." In addition to this confession to her defense attorney, William Randolph Hearst typed up Jane's confession in the New York Journal. In this document, Jane admitted that she wanted the panel of psychiatrists to find her insane. Upon convincing them of this lie, she felt very smug knowing that she had outsmarted a panel of experts. Jane described the exquisite pleasure it gave her to kill her patients, and she marveled at the lack of feeling and remorse she felt for doing these horrible things. And in an attempt to show that she was not without feeling, James claimed that the jilt she received from the lover in her youth seemed to be the root of all of her problems. Jane, he was not the problem. He probably didn't exist. You're the problem. She said, if I had been a married woman, I probably would not have killed all of these people. I would have had my husband, my children, and my home to take up my mind. You took care of many people's family members. You could have been preoccupied. You decided to kill people. It's not his fault. The imaginary guy who didn't actually propose to you, probably. So after all of this, Jane spent the remainder of her life at the Taunton Insane Hospital in fear that her food was being poisoned, which is literally the funniest thing I have ever heard. Can you say irony? She wrote the doctor, I wish to inform you that I am still alive in spite of the food which has been served me. Many efforts have been made to poison me. Of that I am very sure. I am hungry all the time. Every nerve is calling for food. Why can't I have help? Not one single person wants to help you, honey. You burn that bridge. While in the asylum, she was said to have shown no remorse. She lacked seriousness when even confessing to the crimes. She said that killing had become a habit of her life and was said to have lost no sleep over it. She said, I cannot realize what an awful thing it is. Why don't I feel sorry and grieve over it? I cannot make sense of it. Well, Jane, that's because you're a psychopath who lacks empathy, and that's not your fault. But what is your fault is knowing that you are not supposed to commit murder and commit any kind of crimes like these, knowing that they're wrong and still doing it. Jane slowly degenerated and died alone in the hospital in 1938. But like, who could have been there for her? Because she killed anyone and everyone that ever cared about her. Jane confessed to 31 murders. However, she may have been responsible for well over 100. Unfortunately, she couldn't remember how many, since it had become such a habit. Enjoy hell, Honora. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Asylum Sundays. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with your grandma. And if you don't, I appreciate you anyways. Bye! I have a hair. Oh, makeup. At the hands of their fodder. Got it. I don't ever burp, and then as soon as I get on here.
Your mom's a hoe.
What the Spooky. Happy Halloween. What is this? Series Asylum Sundays. I'm your host, Squeaky Chair.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
Balls. That's what scary looks like.